She walked through the courtroom as if she were very confident because a Colorado judge has reversed the conviction of Letecia Stauch in the murder of her stepson. According to CBS News Colorado, on the 2nd of April 2026, inside a courtroom in the state of Colorado, the atmosphere turned heavy as the judge read a decision that left nearly everyone present struggling to believe what they had just heard. A woman who had once been sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for the murder of an 11-year-old boy, was suddenly told that her entire conviction had been overturned. For the victim's family, the ruling was not just a shock, it reopened the very pain they had spent years trying to survive.
No, I wouldn't have not left you. At home with what turned out to be your murderer and the last person to ever see you on this earth.
For the defendant, it became a rare second chance to walk into a new trial where her fate could be decided all over again. But to understand how a single procedural issue could unravel an entire case, if you've never heard of a case where, after 3 years, a verdict is overturned and a retrial becomes necessary, then prepare yourself because what happened in Colorado will challenge everything you thought had quietly come to an end. And the grief the victim's family believed they had finally begun to move past is now returning to them once again. We have to go back to where everything began, when what seemed like a simple incident unfolded into one of the most disturbing and widely followed criminal cases in recent years in the United States. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, a suburban neighborhood provided the setting for a household that appeared stable from the outside. Inside that home lived 11-year-old Gannon Stauch and his stepmother, Letecia Stauch. Gannon's father was frequently away due to military duties, leaving Letecia as the primary caregiver. By most accounts, daily life followed a routine typical of many American families. Gannon was described as a quiet child who spent his time at home and school without any known behavioral concerns. Letecia managed the household during her husband's absence, handling responsibilities that included supervising Gannon's daily activities. According to prosecutors, over time, she developed a sense of frustration tied to her role. They argued she felt burdened by caregiving responsibilities and dissatisfied within the marriage. From the outside, there were no clear warning signs. Neighbors saw a family living an ordinary life. However, beneath that surface, unresolved tension had begun to take shape, setting the stage for events that would soon follow. On the 27th of January 2020, Gannon remained at home in Colorado Springs with his stepmother, Letecia Stauch. His father was away on military duty, leaving Letecia as the only adult present. Investigators later identified this period as the last confirmed time frame in which Gannon Stauch was alive. No reports indicated that he had plans to leave the house independently that day. Surveillance footage from a neighboring property documented activity outside the residence. The video showed Letecia leaving the home with Gannon. At a later point, the same vehicle was seen returning. Gannon was not visible at that time. This discrepancy would become a central point of interest for investigators. At first, the footage did not immediately establish what had occurred. However, when placed alongside later findings, it raised questions about the sequence of events inside the home. Those questions would guide the early direction of the investigation in the hours and days that followed. After Gannon was no longer seen inside the home, the next step that entered the official record was a call to emergency services. It was Letecia who contacted 911 to report him missing. The call established the initial narrative that law enforcement would rely on in the earliest stage of the case. During the call, her tone was described as controlled and measured, without signs of panic typically associated with a missing child report. She stated that Gannon had left the house to play with a friend and had not returned. When the dispatcher asked for additional details, she was unable to provide the name of the friend or any parent connected to that account. That lack of specificity was noted, but not immediately treated as evidence of wrongdoing. The report placed Letecia in the position of a concerned caregiver seeking assistance. Her statements, as given in that call, would later be reviewed alongside other evidence as investigators began to examine the timeline more closely. After the initial report was made, law enforcement officers arrived at the residence to conduct a preliminary welfare check and assess the circumstances surrounding Gannon's disappearance. Standard procedures were followed, including a walkthrough of the home and documentation of any visible irregularities. At that stage, the situation was still being treated as a missing child case. During the inspection, officers focused on areas where Gannon was last known to have been. In the bedroom identified as his, investigators observed signs that required further examination. Substances consistent with blood were detected within the room. The presence of these materials did not align with the initial account, that Gannon had simply left the home and failed to return. As additional personnel were called in, the scope of the inquiry began to shift. The physical environment suggested that the circumstances inside the residence were inconsistent with a routine missing person scenario. This observation prompted investigators to secure the location and prepare for a more detailed forensic assessment. In the initial phase, authorities treated the situation as a possible runaway case. That classification reflected the limited information available at the time. However, by the 30th of January, 2020, the case was formally reclassified as an endangered missing child investigation. The change was based on Gannon's age, the length of time he had been unaccounted for, and concerns related to his need for medication. Following that shift, law enforcement agencies initiated a large-scale search operation across El Paso County and Douglas County. The effort involved coordination between local police, federal agents, and community members. The FBI joined the investigation, providing additional resources and support. More than 200 volunteers assisted in ground searches. Specialized units deployed trained search dogs, while aerial teams used drones and helicopters to cover broader areas. As the search expanded, public attention increased, media coverage intensified, and the case quickly moved beyond the local level, becoming a matter of national concern as the search continued without immediate results. During the initial stage of the investigation, Letecia was interviewed multiple times by law enforcement. These interviews were conducted as part of standard procedure in a missing child case, with investigators seeking to clarify the timeline and gather consistent details about Gannon's last known movements. At first, her statements aligned with the account given during the 911 call. However, as questioning continued, discrepancies began to emerge. Over the course of several interviews, her version of events changed. She introduced different explanations for Gannon's disappearance, including claims that he may have been abducted and references to an unidentified individual who had approached or attacked them. These accounts were not supported by physical evidence or independent witness statements. Investigators documented each variation and compared them against available data, including surveillance footage and known timelines. The inconsistencies became a central concern. While changing details in stressful situations can occur, the pattern observed here led authorities to reassess her credibility and consider the possibility that key information was being withheld. On the 2nd of March 2020, Letecia Stauch was taken into custody in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, following several weeks of investigation. By that point, Gannon had not been located, but authorities had gathered sufficient evidence to conclude that he was no longer alive. The arrest marked a shift in the case, from a missing child investigation to a homicide prosecution. Law enforcement officials coordinated with agencies across state lines to locate and detain her. She was held without bond under South Carolina law while awaiting extradition. The charges filed included first-degree murder of a child under the age of 12, child abuse resulting in death, and tampering with physical evidence. During initial court proceedings in South Carolina, she appeared before a judge and waived her right to contest extradition. Arrangements were then made to transfer her back to Colorado, where formal prosecution would continue under the jurisdiction of El Paso County authorities. On the 17th of March 2020, investigators confirmed that Gannon's remains had been located in Florida, marking a turning point in the case. The discovery was made beneath a bridge in a remote area, far from where he had first been reported missing in Colorado Springs. According to official findings, the remains were recovered inside a suitcase that had been placed in a waterway below the bridge. The condition and placement of the suitcase indicated a deliberate effort to conceal it. The area was secured immediately, and forensic teams began a systematic examination to preserve and document all evidence. The distance between Colorado Springs and the recovery site was more than 1,200 miles. That detail highlighted the extent of the effort involved and became a key factor as investigators continued to reconstruct the full sequence of events. Following the initial response, the residence was processed as a potential crime scene and assigned to a forensic team. Inside the home, investigators later determined that the assault occurred in Gannon's bedroom. Evidence presented at trial indicated that Gannon Stauch was subjected to multiple forms of violence within a confined space. Forensic findings described a sequence of injuries consistent with repeated stabbing, followed by blunt force trauma. The fatal injury was identified as a gunshot wound to the head. These conclusions were based on autopsy results and physical evidence recovered during the investigation. According to prosecutors, the events unfolded within a relatively short period of time on the 27th of January 2020. No signs suggested the presence of another individual inside the residence during that time frame. After the assault, Letecia Stauch remained in the home. Investigators later testified that efforts were made to clean the scene. Blood evidence had been partially removed, and items within the room appeared to have been repositioned. These actions were presented as deliberate attempts to conceal what had occurred before any report was made. Based on these findings, the initial assessment shifted. The investigation reached its critical turning point when the evidence no longer supported a simple missing child report. Detectives began comparing Letecia's statements with surveillance video, phone records, digital activity, and forensic findings from the home. One of the earliest conflicts came from neighborhood security footage. According to investigators, video showed Letecia leaving the residence with Gannon at about 10:16 a.m. on the 27th of January 2020. Later, at about 2:22 p.m., her vehicle returned. Gannon was not seen getting out. That gap became a central question because it did not match the claim that he had left to visit a friend. Phone records gave investigators another layer of the timeline. Prosecutors used Letecia's device activity to review her calls, movements, and communications before and after the report. Location data connected her to areas outside the immediate neighborhood, and later helped support the theory that evidence had been moved. Investigators also reviewed data indicating travel toward the Florida Panhandle, where Gannon's remains were later found. On January 26, text messages added context. Letecia messaged Gannon's father that Gannon had stomach pain. The next day, Gannon did not go to school. She also contacted her employer, saying she could not work because a family member had been in an accident. Prosecutors treated those communications as part of a broader timeline, not as isolated remarks. Her internet search history was also examined. One reported search asked how to fix carpet after a child had burned it. Investigators considered that search significant when compared with evidence from Gannon's bedroom, where blood was found on the mattress, carpet, walls, baseboards, and near an electrical outlet by the bed. The physical evidence became the strongest part of the case. Blood found inside the home was identified as Gannon's. Blood on Letecia's shoe was also connected to him. Authorities reported DNA evidence on a firearm linked to the case. Investigators believed there had been an effort to clean the scene, remove visible blood, and shift attention away from the house. But the cleanup was incomplete. Blood evidence, surveillance footage, phone records, text messages, search history, and travel data remained, allowing investigators to reconstruct a case that increasingly pointed away from disappearance and toward homicide in a clear and documented sequence for prosecutors and the court. As investigators reassessed the case, their focus shifted toward Letecia based on a combination of conflicting statements and increasingly specific physical evidence. Her accounts changed over time, and key details could not be verified. The claim that Gannon had gone to a friend's house remained unsupported, with no names, addresses, or witnesses identified. Taken together, these findings established a consistent pattern, leading authorities to identify Letecia as the primary suspect. During subsequent interviews, investigators conducted more structured questioning to compare Letecia's prior statements with the evidence that had been collected. As the process continued, her explanations shifted again. Earlier claims involving a friend or an unknown assailant were not repeated consistently, and new details were introduced without corroboration. Detectives documented each variation and addressed specific inconsistencies, focusing on timelines, movements, and the events inside the home. As part of the legal process, Letecia underwent a court-ordered psychological evaluation. During that assessment, she made a statement acknowledging that she had shot Gannon. This admission did not occur during a standard police interview, but within the context of a mental health evaluation conducted for the purpose of assessing criminal responsibility. Despite that statement, her defense maintained a position that she was not legally responsible at the time of the incident. They argued that her mental state impaired her ability to understand or control her actions, which became a central issue for later proceedings. In 2023, the case proceeded to trial after more than 3 years of investigation and pre-trial motions. The proceedings took place over several weeks, allowing both sides to present a detailed account of the evidence before the jury. Prosecutors structured their case around a clear sequence of events, relying on forensic findings, digital records, and documented behavior to argue that the actions were deliberate and carried out with awareness. The defense approached the case from a different direction. Their strategy focused on Letecia's mental condition at the time of the incident. They argued that she was experiencing a severe psychological break and was not capable of understanding her actions or conforming her behavior to the law. This created a central legal conflict for the jury, whether the evidence demonstrated intent or whether her mental state prevented criminal responsibility. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict in 2023. Letecia was found guilty on multiple charges presented by the prosecution. These included first-degree murder of a child under the age of 12, child abuse resulting in death, and tampering with physical evidence. Each count reflected a different aspect of the conduct described during the trial, from the act itself to the handling of the scene and subsequent actions. The verdict indicated that the jury accepted the prosecution's argument that the actions were intentional and not the result of an impaired mental state. The defense position, which centered on a lack of criminal responsibility due to mental illness, was ultimately not adopted. At sentencing, the court imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction. Additional convictions carried separate penalties, but the life sentence became the controlling term. The ruling effectively meant that Letecia would remain in custody for the remainder of her life under the original judgment. On the 2nd of April 2026, the legal status of the case changed following a decision from the Colorado Court of Appeals. The court reviewed the trial record and determined that a fundamental issue had occurred during jury selection. As a result, the prior convictions were reversed, and the case was sent back for further proceedings. The decision was not based on a re-examination of the forensic evidence or the factual findings presented at trial. Instead, it focused on the composition of the jury. The court concluded that a juror, who should have been excluded due to bias, was allowed to participate. That determination was classified as a structural error, meaning it affected the integrity of the trial itself. Because of that finding, the original verdict could not stand under legal standards. The ruling created the possibility of a new trial, where the evidence could be presented again before a different jury. At this stage, the case remains unresolved within the judicial process. The outcome of this case leaves a record defined not only by what happened, but by what continues to follow. Gannon was an 11-year-old child whose life ended inside his own home. For his family, that loss does not close with a verdict or a ruling. His father has had to endure both the absence of his son and the prolonged legal process that followed. The possibility of another trial means returning to the same facts, the same evidence, and the same questions that have already been examined in court. What remains is not a single moment of grief, but an extended period of uncertainty that continues to shape how the family moves forward. Several conclusions can be drawn from the record itself. The first is that risk is not always external. In this case, the critical events occurred in a familiar environment, involving individuals already part of daily life. The second is that attempts to conceal a crime often create additional evidence. Actions taken to clean, move, or explain events can leave patterns that investigators later identify through forensic and digital analysis. The third is that legal outcomes are not always final. Even when evidence is substantial, procedural requirements can alter the course of a case. For that reason, accountability depends not only on the facts, but on a process that is conducted correctly at every stage.